Hey, everybody. It's so great to be here. I am very, very excited because I have a special guest to talk with us about the Dead Space remake music, Trevor Gureckis. Hey, Trevor.
Hey, Marco, how's it going?
Good, really good, really good. I'm so incredibly excited to have you here because, the other day I happened to play through, well, the other day it was 12 hours. So I didn't spend all day playing Dead Space, but I would be unwell if I played it a full day. But I really had the pleasure of listening to your work and obviously experiencing what was a pretty horrifying and traumatic experience playing this game. And so I sort of wanted to just talk about, we have a bunch of community questions and also just talk about sort of your thought process in the compositional aspects, especially considering that I know that you're very well versed in suspense and in this sort of horror genre. So
Sure.
yeah. So I guess right off the bat, my first thought is, how does it make you feel to compose? I know that obviously you've composed music for Servant and obviously, of course, this Dead Space remake, which I know you're a fan of. Like, what's it like for you to compose horror music? It's such an interesting thing because it doesn't necessarily have a melody, but at the same time, it is music. So this is a funny thing. I was curious about your perspective on that.
I mean, it's fun. It can be a lot of things. Horror music can be like purely textural for sure, and you're really just getting at sounds and textures, brass hitting ugly sound, hits and rips and stuff, trying to capture that visceral reaction, or like percussion that's just a banging and swiping and stuff, which is thrilling. So it's kind of like a little bit actiony in that way. There's also this like unknown space where you jump into kind of an ambient world a little bit. You can actually have a lot of harmonic language within that world, but it's sort of like if you have like a section that's in like E flat minor kind of, you have to kind of pair it with a bunch of stuff that's aleatoric and wild surrounding it to create textures and unsettling sound. So it's a lot of like small details and a focus on that kind of like experience musically.
It really does sound like there's a ton of texture and there's a ton of layering as well. Like it's not just like sustained strings. It's strings with a dissonance, and then there's like, the violins are doing one thing and then the violas right underneath and then the cellos are doing something else. Like there's this whole, and then of course you have the brass doing that the thing.
Yeah.
Like there's that. It's really interesting to hear.
I mean, there's so many different kind of like moments in a horror situation. It could be an attack. It could be lead up to something or the lead up to nothing. But the idea is still to kind of create a constant sense of unsettling. And I enjoy exploring the sounds and discovering new ways of creating sounds with like either instruments that I play, kind of play, which is like violin and cello, which I kind of play, and then the like stuff that I do with orchestra and electronics and stuff.
Yeah. It's sort of interesting from, I studied, obviously, for a decade, I was an opera singer, and I technically still am. Like, you can never not be an opera singer. Just professionally, I was an opera singer for a decade-ish. And, one of the things that's really interesting to me is, in speaking with you, a modern-day composer, is the idea, especially in this horror aspect specifically, is just this idea that, like, we study folks like Schoenberg or Berg or Weber, this sort of Webern, excuse me, very different, this sort of 12-tone rows and the second Viennese school and stuff. Do you ever think about these sort of older composers that sort of pave the path for sort of, especially in horror, where I feel like there's sort of an atonality possibly, and, sort of we're blurring the lines between tonal and not tonal and chromatic and not chromatic and dissonant and not dissonant, you know what I mean? Do you ever think about that, or do you just sort of do your thing and move on?
I mean, I don't really necessarily track a 12-tone row or something in a score, but actually Webern was a huge influencer for like my score for Servant, season 1 actually, because of the transparency of the score. It got crazier and crazier as the show went on. So season 4 was like crazy. Now it's insane. But the first we were trying things that were just like one note and then like some bowed Glock and, just like that kind of sound, that kind of pointillistic traditional thing. And to me, that was like really exciting to experiment with. really much chamber music. So I really wanted to find that language, which I think has a lot of potential in that space. So it's a small, story, this small story in a house and like these
Yeah.
kind of weird people and a weird baby thing. And I don't,
Yeah.
but with Dead Space, it's like the scope is just much more of the Penderecki and
Yeah, I heard
Ligeti,
that. Yeah.
those composers who were kind of doing extended techniques that were having the whole orchestra doing very weird sounds,
Hmm.
or unusual techniques on their instruments. I mean, to them, they weren't they were experimenting and creating really interesting sounds. They weren't necessarily thinking this is horror music when they were writing it,
Right. Sure.
It had been reframed that way by like, Stanley Kubrick
Hmm.
and
Hmm. Hmm.
in 2001 and The Shining when he put their music in his films, and you're like, oh, that's just so crazy and weird sounding. But Penderecki's like string quartet and stuff, like just watching the score and seeing it played, it's like exciting and thrilling just to watch. But if you hear it outside and you think like what's going on, because you're watching these players do all these crazy things, like they're just
Yeah.
flipping their bow around, and it's almost like they're doing this crazy acrobats just to do these wild sounds. But in the context of an unsettling image, the two things can be really disturbing. I think the film music kind of took those two ideas and went with it and kind of like got into like Alien and
Right.
Aliens, and that kind of the language of horror music kind of evolved into this kind of like ultra dissonance and aleatoric, meaning somewhat improvised hyper dissonance, that kind of stuff. And I do a lot of that in my score with in Dead Space to create really raw intensity.
Well, the max amount of tension, which is like
Yeah.
super apparent. I'll never forget that first moment where I went to there was like the luggage and I walked down. Oh, what's this? And then the thing just popped. Ah! It's like incessant string there. I find it really interesting. As you were speaking, I was thinking about the idea that Penderecki and Penderecki, sorry, and others, like I've sung in the credo, which is fairly normal, I guess, in terms of sound quality. But it's sort of interesting how we think about simple versus programmatic music, right? And how you're right, like folks like Stanley Kubrick and sort of 2001 Aliens, as we've evolved in terms of how we compose or what we compose for, how different it is because in a lot of ways it's also kind of interesting to me, but like in a way, do you feel like Dead Space is a bit of like almost like a symphony? Like the way that you structure the tracks, like from start to finish, it feels more like a programmatic, like a tone poem where we're telling a story through the different, I don't know what your take on that is, but it's certainly, I thought about it while I was playing. I was like, oh, I wonder how this.
Yeah, I mean, when starting the game, took an approach of re-examining the lore of Dead Space and thinking about things like the unitology religion,
Mm,
the cult religion, corruption, the ship, like what it sounds like, and like try to describe that musically. So I was writing suites, like kind of 5-minute suites or
cool.
something. So in a way, they are little pieces that are designed, and they kind of have a big beginning, middle, end. And I wasn't composing to this particular scene just yet, because we were just trying to just come up with like concepts and ways in which we could connect things later, this material could be tied into chapters and stuff.
Oh.
We wouldn't figure it out. They'd figure it out later,
Mhm.
but they first wanted to just see if they could come up with like a language, and then make sure it got the sound right, and then get like kind of like work it all out. But taking that time to like really approach it in a symphonic way, thinking thematically, which was one of my major tasks, was to connect a lot of dots along the way of the game, either with like Isaac's girlfriend that he's like searching
Mhm.
for on the ship. They had like a new storyline for her, their connection as well. So they wanted music for that, but also they wanted to just like reinforce some elements that they thought they could like heighten. And that could be things like the idea of corruption or the idea of losing your mind.
Mhm.
And that kind of becomes more apparent as the game progresses, because I'm playing the game now. So I wasn't involved in the implementation. I wrote all the music, or did like worked on like cutscenes and like, you know, all these bits and pieces of things, but I never actually like played the game. Wasn't given that amazing opportunity. So I'm just catching up just like everyone, but I'm starting to see now how things are kind of like unfolding that we had, you know, talked about, and I'm starting to see obviously how the game changes itself, and it always changed. It always got like darker and
Yeah.
grosser and stuff and more grotesque. And we wanted the score to do the same.
Well, in a way, you know, it sounds like it's kind of like takes some sort of motives, or I don't know that they're necessarily light motives. Oh, there are some, of course. When you pick up a weapon, there's that light motive in theory. But do you feel like you were able to? I was just thinking about how like you're talking about things and how they all connect, and so you want to have that through line where they can grab pieces then of like you know, the thing you wrote from 3 hours ago and connect it to whatever, or the first time we meet Nicole and then you see her again later on, like having that sort of
Yeah, there's like a little piano piece that
yeah.
becomes a little bit more, and I ended up being like that was taken out of a early draft of a piece, and they're like, actually, you know, that could be like Nicole's thing. So then I did like string arrangements of it, and then like so I, you know, I was providing like assets for them to work with, so they could like find places where they would put it in,
drag and drop it.
yeah, exactly. So edited in.
It's such an interesting thing. I mean, I just think that music for video games is such a fascinating thing because it's really at the like peak thrust of like where people consume their media. And I think more so than certainly more so than going to a symphony hall, video games or film especially, but video games even more so, I feel, is like where there's this big thrust of we invite people in and we showcase. It's sort of interesting, and it makes me wonder about like if the modern symphony hall, like, you know, what the evolution of modern music is in terms of like, you know, talking about the great olds from the past and the classical period and the Baroque and Romantic and stuff. Like, you know, if video games and having people hear your score, for instance, like you're essentially like bringing them into the world of symphonic music. It's really exciting to me as a person who loves classical music.
Yeah, I mean, I do wonder if people hear my score in the game or else next to the game, you know, their experience with it. It comes from a tradition of the classical tradition. I mean, I'm trained in that tradition myself because I went to, you know, school to do that. But yeah, I'm just thinking like, could any of this music be played on the on the stage? Because it's like, because sometimes these cues are like so layered that we have like I should send you some like a score to show you, but like there's just layers and layers and layers.
It's just like 400 musical
of like of strings. It's like string pass 1, like string pass 2, you know, then it's just all the low stuff, and then string pass 3, you know, it's like over and over. I'm like, this is not an orchestra.
Yeah, but it's cool to consider that like someday they could do like, you know, the cutscenes of Dead Space remake and
yeah,
like
right.
like, you know, these like, you know, it's sort of it's just fascinating to me, and it certainly is. Well, I hope it's exciting. You know what I mean? That this is music is alive.
But there is a through line that I think that if I were a young person who was like interested in hearing this music and being like, oh, this sounds like really cool, this orchestra's doing all this cool stuff, I'd be like, wow, you should listen to this composer, because this composer in the 60s, because he actually, like, you know, Penderecki like changed. He stopped writing that kind of music in like the 80s or something. I don't know. I think he started writing like symphony. He started doing like symphony in G minor and like by like 1990 or something. But before, like, so in the 60s, he was doing like all this crazy stuff, and it's super cool, and it's the hot stuff of like of what people are doing in film and film, TV, and games for horror. And you know, when they want to get like that sound, it's the they look for some of these effects, you know, that were like designed. And some of the things that I do I'm not copying that alone. I mean, I'm also using a lot of electronics. So there's a little bit of like a modernization of it as well, because sub bass stuff and things like that are not like in the orchestra for like the modern audio experience, I guess. I don't know what, but yeah, there is that orchestral tradition lives on I think, and it lives on in what composers are doing in video games and film and TV. But there's a lot of great music there too. So it's a great place to look.
For sure. And I certainly think it's one of those things that my soapbox is always, the fact that we really need to video game music in particular should be taken more seriously. You know what I mean? And I think there's such a wealth of just an overabundance of fantastic music
Oh
that
yeah, definitely.
composers are, this is a very alive thing. It's an incredible, I think it's an incredible time, even more so than, I'm 35. When I was growing up in the 8-bit, 16-bit style, while we did have, of course, we had geniuses that were also composing for limited hardware. It is certainly interesting now, having spent such a long period of my life immersed with classical music, to hear the true essence of fully orchestrated tracks and things. So it's I could talk about this all day. We should probably move to some community questions, just because I'm over here already 20 minutes in. So one of the questions is, what was prioritized more, making the player feel dread or making the soundtrack feel distinct?
That is a good question. The drama is definitely the driver of what we were trying to do. So one thing that I struggled with a lot when I was writing, it required a lot of revision on my part, was high intensity music. And that's something that's like in Jason Graves' original score is quite apparent and quite easy to come by. Like the high, like super high intense, like blasting, chop, almost marching with anvils and stuff.
Yeah.
That kind of music. So it was sort of like, well, so what's your version of that? So we're trying to find my thing. And it wasn't about like finding an original version of it, but finding like how to connect some of the things I was doing that were a little bit more ambient, that were working really well, I think. And then getting that material up to level 11.
10 or yeah.
10 or 11, right? And we were just listen back, and this is me and the audio team, and they would be like, this isn't hitting as hard, or so we'd be like, okay. And so I'd be like analyzing, or just be thinking about like, okay, so what's the thing, what's the like the brass are hitting, like we need the awkward, like the off hits, we need the like really need to think about what makes a really intense like 2-minute loop or 2.5-minute loop kind of thing. And then like a steady, though, like nonstop brutal experience. That was a good learning experience, but also really difficult to figure out.
Well, you mentioned something about ambient music, and I think that that's one of the things that I actually like the most about the score, is that sometimes, typically when we hear ambient music, we're usually hearing some sort of sound effect or something, but it was really impressive there are, of course, sound effects. What was really impressive to me is ambient music through strings. I don't hear that a lot in video games in general. And so to hear this sort of like, you're walking and you hear like, I thought that was so interesting from a musical perspective to have that. Because then you're right. Because then it shifts into high gear, and then it's there, but it's all starts from this sort of like low rumble almost, that it's like persistent throughout, and then you get hit with it. It's very cool.
Cool. Yeah. I really do like playing or experimenting with a lot of string textures to create like layers and layers, so that there's sort of like, it's ambient in that it's like obviously not hitting you on the head with stuff, and you're not like being attacked by something, but it's like suspended tension or whatever. It's like and that's always kind of present in the game.
Yeah, for sure. What material do they give you before you start composing? Just concept art, finished levels, videos? What was given to you?
I had a meeting with the head writer of the game, the remake. Her name is Jo Berry. That was really helpful. So she helped me kind of see the whole, it was like a presentation, really. Kind of like that. Isaac is kind of going on this Dante's Inferno like journey to hell with all the different characters. Gave a good guidance as to how things were going down, and how we could describe like the different elements of the religion and the necromorphs and like all this kind of stuff. So in that way, it's really rudimentary. From other elements that I got to work with were like cutscene parts, storyboards, and mocaps kind of like put together. So I would see like these like just kind of really simple mocap videos next to a storyboard, and I would score that. And then sort of like in the hive mind scene, which is like a final battle, final boss scene. That one was like kind of a early game capture of someone playing the game. So
Oh.
they actually did a little bit of a kind of a rough render,
Mhm.
and then it jumped into the someone playing like an early version of the game. And it had like all these like little squares.
Oh.
Because they weren't like, nothing was like done yet. They're like, this is gonna be something.
Yeah.
But I was scoring it like it was the thing, and that's like an 8-minute track, I
Yeah,
think
it's
something like
very
that.
long.
So it's
It's very long.
and then he was like running out the door, so
Mhm.
running into the ship. So that was a combination. So it was a little bit of like communication with from the dev team to those little bits and pieces. But yeah, I didn't play or get any like, live demos necessarily, or maybe a couple little. Yeah, maybe I saw a few live demos of it, but it was while we were like just doing like discussions about like how the tram system worked or whatever. But
Well, it just goes to show that your imagination is vast, to be able to like look at, a couple little dots and create something that you know what I mean? Like
But I did watch a lot of the old game and the
Mhm.
original game for inspiration because I would just mute what that was on and
Mhm.
play it as a reference, especially when I was doing these high intensity cues because I was trying to see like, does this feel like this is,
High into that.
yeah, does it feel right? I mean, this is like the polished version of it, of the 2008 version. And I would just put whatever I was working on and just kind of put it up on my screen and just have it like run a loop and and that was just like on my own, just to like see if I was getting like the terror going. Yeah.
I mean, honestly, like it's such a fascinating thing for me as I always view myself, I still view myself as an interpreter of music rather than a creator of it. And sometimes people are like, well, compose something. And I'm like, I don't know the first thing about composition. Like, I mean, I know, I know, but like, so it's always interesting to me to like, interact with a composer, which I haven't done. You're the first composer I've interacted with. Ooh, in a while. I mean, interacted with in the sense that like, I've sung new works and stuff for opera. So it's so interesting to me to just like the idea that you would sit down and just watch things and push like your brain just goes, and it's fascinating, especially coming from the place of like taking that material and then interpreting it so that an audience like fully fleshes it out and understands it from an emotional perspective. It's just so interesting, and it's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to capture some of the same intensity and then same drive and stuff, whatever for the cues that I was like kind of replacing, and I just needed to understand kind of like what was working about the original and mute what was there and play it against it and see if it was like comparable,
Yeah, yeah.
which was a daunting task because the original score is great. I mean, I loved it. I played it myself as a gamer back in 2008, and it was super cool when it came out. I remember it distinctly because I was like, this is like insane.
Yeah,
I can't believe this is the score for a video game. Yeah, it was a great learning experience trying to figure this stuff out.
for sure. I mean,
Yeah.
that was a very good question too. What was your favorite track from the soundtrack?
It's hard because I there was a lot of hard work and energy put into the hive mind.
Yeah.
So there's an element of that one being pretty like fun to listen back to and being because it's just so out of control,
Hmm.
which is pretty cool. But I do have like a more probably maybe more of an emotional connection to something like Make Us Whole, which is like the choir and
Hmm.
the strings and stuff and like zero G and that stuff. And now that I'm playing the game, whenever I come back, I hear zero G a lot. So now I hear that track so much. And it's kind of like rearranged a little bit. Like they have like the complete stems of like everything
Hmm.
they have. So they like like they do kind of like a little bit of arrangements of it, adjustments. So they'll like take out like the English horn sometimes, or they'll remove the top string parts or whatever, and they'll just do like little things to make it feel a little bit different each time. So, I mean, that one's a cool one too. That one's not really a committal answer, but I guess I was like, part of me was like, I really worked hard on that one. So
yeah, well, that's fair. That's reason enough to have it be your favorite. Let's be real. If you're ever in a creative slump, what do you do to get out of it?
Yeah, creative slump. It's terrifying. I play video games. It's probably, I don't know if that would be a good thing, and probably make me forget. Then that's it. Then I'd come right back to it. You know what? I'd probably pull out like a real instrument to play, because sometimes I'll get a little caught up in like samples or synths or something, and being like too much on my like keyboard here, and be like, you know what? I should go to the piano and play something like on a real thing. Or like on my weird like Marvin metal instrument, and or like other weird, just like record something that's like this off, or like one of my keyboards, my synth keyboards, to break the cycle. Yeah, because that way you're thinking about like the performance of the physicality of playing this other instrument and not composing, which can be, if you get caught up trying to think about like, oh, what am I supposed to do next? What am I supposed to do next? Instead, you're thinking about just trying to make sound, physicality of, of actually doing it.
It certainly is an interesting thing, right? To like step away from the computer, which is something that we have just constantly in front of us, and to step away and like, go and sit down in a tangible thing and experience it.
Yeah.
How do you decide what music or sound techniques best fit a given location or scene? For example, quiet eeriness, disturbing instrumentation, vocals, or whispers.
It's really dependent on the story, what's happening. So in that way, it's guided by, in the case of Dead Space, like where Isaac is, or what the location is. A lot of the stuff in the game was edited by other people from my music. So I had these suites that they kind of like remade into other pieces. But there are other things that were designed for like specifically for like the religion stuff, or the Zero G was designed for that. And for instance, the religion thing, using voices, right? So I had like a choir singing a pretty, normale like voice part, but in the background I have a friend of mine who's singing in this vocal fry. And she's kind of like floating around in the stereo image going, and it's sort of like, it is one thing to think like, oh yeah, choir cult, like that kind of makes like makes obvious sense, right? But I wanted to like, at least if I was going to have a choir, always, have a little off. So I wasn't afraid to put choir music for the cultish kind of stuff, but I also wanted to make sure I had some of these I don't know if you would call that extended technique, other vocal techniques for the And when we recorded the choir, we also had them sing just like screaming and vocal fries and hush, so you could whispers. Just grab it. Yeah, we just had it was like everyone just whispered, just like tons of whispers, and then it was, and then I later in future sessions, or so after that recording session was done, I'd have all the stuff, and then I could like take that material and use it on future cues, so that I knew that I would like have this material of this choir singing, like doing all this stuff. But it's definitely driven by what the story calls for.
Yeah, that makes sense. again, that programmatic driving the plot
Yeah,
forward
yeah.
through music. I sometimes wonder if video games aren't just modern operas in a weird way because they drive the plot forward with music so much that I don't think
Yeah,
a modern audience understands. Obviously, it's not sung, but
right.
if you remove if you remove the singing and you think about it like a Singspiel, like a Mozart, like a Die Zauberflöte or something, where it's like there's it feels like a musical in some ways. It's
Uh-huh.
I got to write an essay about that.
Yeah.
It's interesting stuff because I really do think about it. I'm like, well, music drives this plot forward so much. Like,
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, totally.
how do you approach composing for loop-based atmospheric environments? Do you like to use sound effects or suspense more?
I don't know if I have a preference. I mean, because um, when I think about some of the loop things that I did, they're not actually on the album, but they're in the game. I used sound design, so I could call it more sound design maybe
Hmm.
than sound effects, because they're not really like sounds of like objects or something, but they're maybe sound inspired by metallic, metallic
Mhm.
clanging, right? So that kind of sounds a little bit like a ship or something, or like the inside of the Ishimura creaking or something. But I'll use that sound, but then I also have the strings holding suspended chords or suspended harmonies and stuff. The thing about looping that I learned, and this is my first video game, so I'm not an expert. I'm just like, oh, it was the first go at it. It's just finding ways of like covering that start over experience, and especially if you do kind of a dovetail thing where you have one note that kind of like connects to the beginning. It feels like it was actually the
Mhm,
beginning was
mhm.
actually it might start fading in. You're not going to know where the beginning is, especially if you have different parts. So
Right.
the way that Dead Space works is that they have like a 4-layer system. So this is 4 tracks. Those stereo tracks get pulled up as intensity increases, or like as you move towards something that's important or something.
Mhm.
Not all 4 at the same time, but for 3. So, and then once you encounter something, you get like a stinger, and then layer 4 starts, and all the others stop. And then
Oh,
you get the action cue music, and then it stops, and then all the other 3 start again, and then it kind of like goes down. It goes 3, 2, 1,
whoa.
go down. So it's kind of like an accordion, I guess, if you were to think about it in terms of the tracks going up and down.
Yeah.
Um, but they all play together well, and they communicate together, so that if I have one that has like a tone that kind of shoots out with a string line that goes dee dun, then I'll have like on the layer 3, which is like quite intense now because we're on layer 3. I'll have like the whole orchestra do that, but with like a hit, like a
Mm,
so it hits on that part. But you don't hear that until you get to the layer 3 intensity, sort of like planning out this thing. So, and to do these cues, which are like really, really a pain in the ass to write, I had like these like huge sessions, and they all had like auxiliary faders, and I would just like kind of like go up, and I would just pull them up and down so
mm.
I could just have it play and just kind of like feel that and try to imitate that experience of like walking down the hallway. It's getting scarier and scarier, and feeling like the whole orchestra is rising,
Yeah.
and everything's getting crazier and crazier, and then it's going away and going away, and that kind of stuff. And each one of those is a complete orchestra take, like a complete orchestration, um, wind brass, choir, whatever, for each one of those layers. That's like 2 minutes for each one. I don't know what I was trying to say.
That's involved. Well, no, we were talking about looping. I mean, no, that makes a
Yeah,
lot of sense. So there's
yeah,
safety mechanisms by having the different layers, and then also, but that's crazy.
yeah.
That's
So
so
right,
much work for.
you just you intensify, and all the kind of like it's like orchestration too. You're kind of doing like a live orchestration by having them synced up, so that as the orchestra gets bigger and there's other kinds of swells going on, or other melodies kind of like sweeping in, and like a cello line kind of revving up, you're also having these like orchestra of hits happening now on things that used to be just like simple little like ambient dots.
Right. Right. God, that is involved.
Yeah.
It's the stuff you don't see. You know what I mean? Like it's impossible to think about that from the outside looking in. That was a great question. What would you consider to be the difference between being a successful horror soundtrack and one that doesn't do as well?
Music outside of its placement in the film, game, or whatever, it can be great within itself. The question is like, how does it function in the game? That's where you really can quite, see if it works, right? So in that case, the question is, how does a horror score, best function, I guess, or I would say that my experience is generally about withholding as much information as possible and not being ahead of the character's knowledge. And this is something that I learned from Night. The more that you score like the character knowing something before it happens, kind of, that defeats the impact of
The
the
resolution.
the reveal or
Yeah.
and that can be ineffective. But because we might know, right?
Mhm.
We're the ones watching and going like, "Oh, it's around the corner! Oh my God, it's around the corner!" But he doesn't know, so
Yeah.
and we just can't. And so in that way, there's generally no reason to have music there. That person has no idea. There's no concept of like why. There's no reason to have music around that kind of thing. So like often when I was working on Servant, we would talk about places where we cut music because we're finding that it gives away too much or it's giving away too much information.
That's interesting. I never thought about that because it's true. Because it's like if we're hearing too much of a musical cue before the big reveal, then it does dampen, and that's the whole point of horror and suspense, right? That we have that suspense, we have that sort of prolonged stretch out of whatever dissonance or what have you. If there's too much of that, then it sort of loses that. There's like a fine line between losing that intensity and so you sort of forfeit the response.
Yeah, that makes you more present, I think, with the character. You become more engaged with their experience and less engaged with the experience of the authors who know everything and who, you know what I mean, who are kind of guiding you or something. And that you definitely don't want to be doing that.
Well, and a prime example of that would be in Dead Space when, like I mentioned before, I think before we started, when the baggage claim first scare where the necromorph walks past, like if there was music right in that before that moment, you immediately would know, oh, there's something up. Whereas like the minute you turn the light on, it's like, oh,
Yeah, right. If there was like some sort of like, lead up to it or something that tell you that something is wrong, you're going to be like, all right, something's wrong here. Well, why would you know that?
Right. Wow, that's interesting. That I would never have thought that would be a way that you could like decipher the difference between good horror and not so good. How did you find writing a soundtrack that needed to straddle a line between being very fitting for the atmosphere and interesting, but not also distracting the player from ambient sounds and the gameplay itself?
The hard part, I think, with Dead Space, I mean, speaking of information, is the amount of sound design. There's like a heart rate thing now. There's you can hear his heartbeat now. Lighting effects are just like super intense. Just like obviously it goes to complete black, and then it's just like these huge like flashing lights everywhere. So yeah, so where does the music fit in this? And it's you want the music to play to like Isaac's experience, I think, which is your experience, but I mean, ultimately we're scoring the story of Isaac, and then there to be breaks for that so that you can have those moments of reprieve so you can hear the sound design and you can hear that, because otherwise there's just like a lot of music and it's just like so much information that you're hitting you all at the same time. I try to I do have a lot of like textures and ideas in my music. I do try to have like a subject or like at least thematic concepts sometimes or most of the time, so that there is a I guess a subject that was it, so you can at least like be able to kind of point to and be like, oh, that's the thing that's happening, that you can, if all else fails in the middle of total mayhem, you could still go like, oh yeah, I hear the bass line and that's like probably the thing that's like the guiding track here, even though I know that like mayhem is happening
Mhm.
everywhere else. And that can break out into total disaster, and there's strings going flying everywhere, and the brass are like wailing, and there's hits and all this kind of stuff. But then it'll come together again for like moments of like some sort of like clarity or organization. Otherwise, it feels like just total mayhem constantly. And if it's total mayhem and sound design is also mayhem, I think it can be cluttered. It can be too much cluttering.
Well, there's something, that's something really of note. And it was something that during my playthrough where there were quiet parts where it was, let's say, predominantly sound design, let's say, or clanking of Isaac's footsteps or whatever.
Mm,
Like there is certainly, I think it would be a little bit too cacophonous in terms of like your ears would get tired and then you wouldn't want to
yeah,
really listen to it anymore. So it is that fine balance between
yeah,
doing
totally.
too much and doing not enough.
Right.
Um, well, Trevor, I really appreciate you coming on. I mean, this
Yeah.
has been so profoundly interesting, and certainly, I just am so grateful that this music exists, and it's so different from what maybe people are used to. And I think it's been great to shine at least a little bit of a light on the process and the creation of it. So I really appreciate you wanting to come on and
Absolutely. Thank you,
yeah,
Marco. Yeah.
of
It's
course,
been a
of
lot of fun.
course, yeah. And as always, if you like this sort of stuff, feel free to like and subscribe. It always helps me to, have awesome guests like this. And yeah, thanks a ton. And we'll talk to you later. Bye.